All right, guys. Week 14 is it's almost a wrap, man. And what a crazy week 14, man. Like, can we just have a normal week this week? Like, why do
No.
we need 18 injuries? In the matter of just a few hours. Like, we don't need this right now. We really don't. We were just talking about it before we started, and I can't take it anymore. Like, I really can't. Like, me and Zach are going up against each other. I'm trying to get, a higher seed. We both made the playoffs, but I still, and everyone who's trying to make the playoffs this week, you're probably looking at me like, must be nice for us that you make it the playoffs. I'm trying to still make it. I get it. I get it. You had Justin Herbert. You couldn't make it in, whatever. But Nico Collins had to go down with what?
Oh,
He ran two routes. He caught one ball. He was looking good, and then all of
it
a
did look
sudden
good.
he's out. It was out.
Yeah.
C.J. Stroud leaving the game. Justin Herbert getting hurt. I don't know why Alexander
Justin
Madison's
Jefferson.
coming to my head. He's out. Justin
Oh,
Jefferson's left the game. Like, what is happening?
they're all backbreaker injuries, and it's like the last week, like everybody who was supposed to be making these pushes for the playoffs just got boned by injuries. Like it was just terrible.
It's unbelievable, man, and this just sucks. Okay, well, listen, I'll say this: if you made it to the playoffs, congratulations. Listen, we got to fight through all of this, right? Regardless of what's happening, we have to fight through. Okay, this is the reality of what we're going through right now. This is fantasy football. This is part of it. We happen to get hit really hard, week 14 in a week where we needed these guys to come through the most, but didn't really work out the way that it could have. But for a lot of people, you made the playoffs. Okay?
Yeah.
Regardless. So good for you. Me and Zach made the playoffs in most of our leagues. We're doing okay. So let's stick to the positive here. Let's move on. Let's have a good show. Okay, I'm a little on tilt. Maybe you can tell. I can't tell if you can tell. Can you tell?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
If you can.
I could tell. We're all on
Yeah.
tilt.
Okay.
We're all
Cool.
on tilt.
Yeah. A little bit. You know what I'm saying? A little high strung right now. You know what I'm saying? Maybe
Yeah.
it'll make a good show. Who knows?
It's
All right.
just gonna make the podcast that much more interesting. Don't worry about it.
Maybe. All right. So moving on. Let's talk about some takeaways from this show. That's what we're here for. Week 14 takeaways. Let's assume you're going on to week 15 and you care about this stuff, right? And even if you don't, I'm sure you like football, right?
Yeah.
So you care about what's going on. This is a very important time, even if you're not in the playoffs. This is a very important time to continue to pay attention because a lot of things happen. Week 14, week 15, week 16, week 17, even week 18. Pay attention, okay? Don't tune out.
Yep.
Don't tune out just because you didn't make the playoffs, okay? Because you're gonna miss some key information. You're gonna miss some key things that happened, okay?
Yeah. Dynasty fantasy
and
football.
you
It's
have
real.
to pay attention for 2024 if you missed the playoffs. Now, if you made the playoffs, let's go. Let's go.
Yeah.
It's time. It's time.
The
to
other
win some
thing,
fantasy
it's not
championships.
it's not just the playoffs either. I don't know how many leagues have it, but I know in Sleeper, there's this thing they call it toilet bowl, and you need to win out of the toilet bowl so that you're not getting the punishment if you're in
Yes.
the toilet bowl. So there's
That's
definitely a
exactly
reason.
right.
Your season is not over here because now you're fighting for your life at this point. Don't let
1000%.
yourself be the worst team. So yeah, the season is not over whether you're in the playoffs or not at the end of week 14. You still got a couple weeks here that you got to be making moves. You got to be doing everything you can to have the best weeks possible. We're going to help you do that.
All right, let's start with some of the early window games. Okay. Let's start with the Colts. If you had Zack Moss or you picked him up after Jonathan Taylor went down, you were hoping that he would really come through for you. But he had two pretty underwhelming fantasy performances. The volume's there. 22 opportunities on 94% of snaps in week 13. 21 opportunities on 84% of snaps today. Extremely disappointing efficiency-wise in these two games. 2.15 yards per carry for him in this one. Not great in a good matchup. The 8 targets is nice to see, but wish it amounted to more production. If you're in the playoffs, it's almost like you have to start him next week, right? With this type of utilization, because it could lead to a 20-point performance pretty easily.
Yeah, and I know it's really hard to hang your hat on these past two performances that he's had these past 2 weeks. Like, 2 straight games scoring single-digit fantasy points. It's not a winning formula. But if you have Zack Moss, and if I have Zack Moss, I'm absolutely starting him next week and moving forward. Like, I'm clinging tight to that utilization that he's had these past 2 weeks. You know what I mean? Like, what's encouraging to me about what we saw against the Bengals, if there's anything encouraging, in that game, anything to be encouraged by, it was the fact that Moss's volume adapted to the game script. Like, suddenly he gets 8 targets in a game where they were playing from behind the whole time. That checks out for me. The Colts, they were a competitive game. They were in a competitive game last week. He had the 19 carries. They're clearly invested in Moss being a big part of the offense. He's still pretty much always on the field. Like, they say it's not the gift that counts, it's the thought that counts during the holiday season. And as we get closer to Christmas, the fantasy points might not be there right now. They might not be all that in a bag of chips. But the thought behind this utilization, that's what matters to me. Just keep plugging away with him in your lineup. I'm not worried about him. If the volume weren't there, I'd be worried about it. But he's clearly a part of the offense moving forward. Just leave Moss in your lineup.
Michael Pittman was able to have a solid game, 8 for 95 on 11 targets. But Josh Downs, only 3 targets in this one, who went 3 for 32. Gardner Minshew missed him on a wheel route that would have been a touchdown. He was wide open. But regardless, only 3 targets. So not what I expected at all. He had an amazing matchup. But instead, Zack Moss ended up with 8 targets. And the tight ends combined for 12 targets. Like, can someone tell me why or how 4 different tight ends can get targets for one single team in one single game? Okay. And someone like Josh Downs, gets 3 targets. Okay. So, really iffy performance by Gardner Minshew in this one. I was a little too high on both of these guys, Gardner Minshew and Josh Downs this week. I had him as my wide receiver 30 on the week, but apparently that was too high.
Apparently, that was too high. And the thing for me, you mentioned the tight ends. Like, if you ask any just standard rate NFL fan out there, just take someone off the street and ask, can you name a Colts tight end? I don't think they'd be able to. Like, maybe they would say Mo Alley-Cox, right? Because he's been, like, on the radar as, like, a little bit these past few years. But outside of that, like, Will Mallory? Who? What? Who are we talking about here? It's just ridiculous. Extremely disappointing game from Downs, like you mentioned. I don't blame you for having as high as you had him. I was the same way. I thought the volume would be there. But now we have to go back and we have to look and figure out, what did we see from Downs over the past few weeks that had us this high on him? If you look back at just the past 5 weeks that he's played, there's not a whole lot to like outside of that 113 target game. Granted, he was banged up those 2 games before the bye. He played roughly 20% of snaps in both of those games. But he's had just 1 game over 5 targets in the past 5 games. And Michael Pittman, he's clearly resumed his role as a clear number 1 on the outside. So I think at this point, you have to downgrade Josh Downs. As much as I like the talent still, like Dynasty, I'm not worried about him. It's just at this point, the way that the offense is moving, he's not as big a part of the offense as he was earlier in the season. And that could be due to injuries. I'm not sure he's back 100% yet. But this was a really great matchup, and it just felt like he squandered it in a big spot, especially if you were counting on him to get yourself in the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, 100%, man. Joe Mixon came through like we expected. 24 touches, 125 total yards, had the rushing touchdown. This was a good matchup going in. We talked about it on the pod. 63% of snaps. Chase Brown was also very involved. 11 touches, 105 yards himself. 1 week after him getting 9 carries for 61 yards. He's looked very good with his opportunities over these last 2 games. So maybe we see him as a Bengals starter next year if he can keep it going, right? Obviously, the Bengals would be in line for, a candidate to draft a running back early, right? But, because I'm assuming Joe Mixon's not going to be there. But, it was a good matchup for these running backs. They came through. But Jamar Chase, 4 targets in this game. It's the same amount as Joe Mixon, T. Higgins. Yep. Only 17% target share for Jamar Chase, man. Come on, dude. Like, this is moving backwards, okay? Last week was awesome. The usage was great for Chase, but, this went back to what it looked like the week before that. And, we're just going to have to trust Chase, next week against Minnesota. Like, it's just, you can't really bench the guy because, you can do exactly what he did in week 13, right? And, because he has that in him, it's just like, you just got to keep him in your lineup.
Yeah, eat your vegetables. That's like the expression I use all the time with these guys. And I'm just going to go back and touch on Mixon quick before I get on Chase. Joe Mixon, he must have heard us talking about him, being a product of the Bengals offense on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, because he's showing us that he's a big reason why the Bengals offense is still operating at a high level, even without Burrow. Like, he's just kind of turned that on its head. 7 touchdowns over the past 7 games, 5 top 10 finishes in the same span. After he scored just 1 touchdown over the first 6 games of the season, that bye week definitely helped him. The volume is there. The production has followed. He has the production with the volume where Zack Moss didn't have that. He has the utilization, but not the production. So this is just another, interesting case here. But the sad reality of Jamar Chase, there's no such thing as week-to-week consistency thanks to the QB situation. Lots of targets to running backs in this one tells you that as good as he's looked, Jake Browning, he's still a backup quarterback after all, And he went out a little bit in this game. I think he came back. He's not hyper-focused on leaning on his top weapon in Jamar Chase. I think Jamar feels like a solid wide receiver 2 play every week. I don't think that you have to sit here and panic and be like, oh, well, we can't trust him at all in our lineups. You can. But the upside that he had last week against the Jaguars, it's not going to be every week. You're going to have floor weeks like this one too. So you hit the nail on the head pretty much. The fluctuations there, there's no consistency, but I'm still going to put him in my lineup anyway because it's Jamar Chase, and we've seen Jake Browning. He's looked pretty good. It just wasn't Jamar Chase's turn this week. And we know Joe Burrow would lean on Jamar Chase heavily. We saw that coming off of the bye and as Joe Burrow got healthier. But now that consistent production, the consistent utilization isn't there, it's just going to be very finicky with him in your lineup moving forward.
Browning did leave the game for a little bit, but he ended up coming back. He was just fine. I think he had just cramps like in his hand or something like that. Rachaad White has been one of the best fantasy picks at ADP this year. He was he was one of our biggest dynasty targets. He was one of our biggest targets at ADP this year in a redraft. And look at these rushing games now, man. Inefficient early on, and we had to depend on the receiving work. But over 4 yards per carry in each of the last 3 games. He's averaging 20 carries per game during this span here. Straight up league winner, dude. And he definitely helped you get into the playoffs. There's no doubt about that.
It's felt like, and I don't know if you could tell me if it's felt like this, but it's felt like Rachaad White has had the same fantasy performance like 8 games in a row, doesn't it? Like it's felt the same. And it's great. It's fantastic. Like usually when you have this consistency where it feels like the same production every week, it's like a 10 or a 12 point thing. But this is like a 16, 18, 20 points that you're getting every single week. The usage has just been incredible. And we knew that would be the case for him. But what's put him over the top as of late is the Bucs offense looking pretty damn good. We all had the Bucs offense pegged as one of the worst in the league coming into the season. That's what had Rachaad White's price so low coming into drafts. When we were talking about Rachaad White in 2023, it was like he's going to be a volume guy. And, the touchdowns might not always be there, but the volume, if he's going to be getting 20 touches a game, he's going to be fine. But he's getting those touchdowns now. There's not much more we can ask for from White at this point. Just like Joe Mixon, he's averaging a full touchdown per game over his past 6 games, and there aren't any signs of that slowing down anytime soon. He has a pretty neutral matchup against the Packers next week, but that hasn't mattered over his hot streak. Like the matchup has not been something to really consider. Just start White the rest of the way with confidence.
1,000%, man. All right. Now, this was not the week for Mike Evans to decide to have 1 catch for 8 yards. Okay, Mike. We needed you this week. He came through every single week, dude. Not in this matchup, man. We needed you. So even in tough matchups, he came through, and you couldn't get anything going at all today. Chris Godwin ended up leading the team with 11 targets. He only had 5 catches for 53 yards on those 11 targets, but just huge disappointment from Mike Evans this week, man.
Listen, does it suck that he laid his first egg of the year in the final week of the regular season? Yeah, it does. But chances are, if you drafted Mike Evans, you probably weren't teetering on the edge of making the playoffs or missing it anyway, because he's been a fantastic wide receiver. You probably drafted him as like, a dart throw, wide receiver 3, and maybe he'll pan out. Maybe he'll get 5 or 6 touchdowns this year. He's been anything but that. He's just been fantastic. So I have sympathy for you, but at the same time, it's like you're probably not tilting about that this week because you're probably already in the playoffs.
No sympathy from Zach on this one.
Yeah, he earned the right to have a dud. With the way that he's played this year, I'm not going to let one game cloud my judgment of him. He'll still be ranked as a top 10 receiver next week against the Packers, right? Can we say no? He of course he's going to be.
He will. And Jair Alexander, is he going to be back for that matchup? Who knows? But it honestly doesn't matter because Jair Alexander has been giving up a ton of production against him this year. On the other side of the ball, Drake London showed us exactly what he's capable of. And I felt like it was a personal attack on me personally because he went up. You had him in our matchup going up against me. 10 catches for 172 yards. We love that you're capable of this. But, outside of you, Zach, a lot of people probably have Drake London on their bench this week. So, hopefully, you guys had him in your lineup because he definitely came through. Now he has Carolina next week, right? And that's a tough matchup. He's probably a wide receiver 3 for that matchup, but he's just tough to trust, right? For you personally, Zach, does this game make you trust him more, or are you still kind of feeling the same way about him moving forward?
It's not going to change the way I feel about him moving forward. I'm going to say no. I don't trust him anymore after this game because what we've seen from him on a more consistent basis is mediocre to non-satisfactory production his whole season. It's not just, he's getting the targets and not catching. It's like the targets have been all over the place. I've taken the bait before with London. I'm going to say no, especially with the Panthers, like you mentioned, on deck next week. Carolina, they've been legit on defense. Even though the team overall is just terrible, Chris Olave needed a late touchdown to save his day today, and Derek Carr lived up to his name as the league's most mid quarterback against him this week. And,
Damn.
the Panthers have done a very good job of limiting offensive production. Like we talked about it coming in the week. Dak Prescott, CJ Stroud had quiet games against him. CeeDee Lamb had a quiet game against him. The Panthers have been good on defense. That's not the issue. It was great to see London get the double-digit targets and catches, especially since he was in my lineup. But before this week, he only had more than 6 catches in a game once this season, and that was against the Commanders of all teams, the best wide receiver matchup you can have. This was also a really good matchup on paper. His schedule the rest of the way isn't fantastic. What really stood out to me, though, and just straight up shocked me, was the fact that all of the Falcons' top draft picks on offense had solid days. Kyle Pitts scored a touchdown. Did you know that? Bijan Robinson scored a touchdown. Drake London, 170-plus receiving yards. Like, we've entered the twilight zone, right? That's what it feels like. That has to be it.
No, Kyle Pitts, 3 catches for 57 yards on 6 targets with that touchdown. And it's somewhat meaningful because in Week 13, the week before, his route participation jumped from like a consistent 65% to 90% last week. And then he ended up with 8 targets against the Jets that week, right? And then this week, it was at 91%. So we're now seeing 2 weeks in a row of intentional increased usage for Kyle Pitts. Now, this is not the best matchup in the world next week against Carolina, but still startable. And he has 2 solid matchups in weeks 16 and 17. So if you are having tight end trouble, which I know a lot of people are, Pitts is a lot more startable now than he was just a couple weeks ago, simply because he's being used in a much better way,
Yeah.
So still not still not a top 10 tight end for me, but he's somebody that you could stream if you need him.
Yeah, I'm not convincing myself that this is a start of some miraculous turnaround for Pitts either. I think he's a low tight end one at best for me, and that's at best. He's still not anywhere close to where he should be given his talent in terms of his usage. We know the usage has gone up in terms of snap share, but the target share still isn't there. I don't think that's going to be corrected this season. So the fact that we know that it's not just about that coming in, it really waters down the discussion that we have about him every week. So for me, I'm in the same boat as you.
Justin Fields was a great start this week. We talked about it. DJ Moore was a great start this week. We talked about it. Both of them came through big time. DJ Moore with a touchdown on the ground and a touchdown through the air. That touchdown coming under free play. That's exactly what Fields has to do, man. Like, he recognized the free play. He threw it downfield. And, it amazes me when quarterbacks don't throw the ball downfield, give their guys a chance on these free plays, like recognizing the free plays. It happens all the time. Where it's like, this quarterback's like, dude, like, there's a free play. Like, do your thing. Like, you have one job.
Like, check it down to the running back.
It's just like, what are you doing? Or they throw it out of bounds, and I'm just like, give your guy a chance. Who cares, right? But good play there, obviously. DJ Moore ended up with 10 targets. He's a must start with Fields at quarterback. But tough matchup next week against Cleveland. Like, he might not be in my top 10 next week like he's been these past couple weeks because he's had good matchups. So, with that being said, he should be in lineups. But, I got to downgrade him a little bit, especially if Denzel Ward ends up being back next week. But we'll see.
Yeah, the Browns are a really tough matchup on paper. I think we can rank him outside of our top 10 based on what we've seen from the Browns defense this season, but I think his upside's still like right in there.
Yeah.
I think that best case scenario for him is still inside the top 10, and it might be more difficult for him to hit that, in a tough matchup versus what he's seen these past few weeks. But he's had at least 9 targets in each of these past 4 games, and he's definitely helped a lot of teams push for the playoffs. There's no reason to even consider benching him, moving forward. Remember, like we said, tough matchup next week. Great matchup in week 16, though, against the Cardinals. I think Moore is going to have a safe enough floor that he won't be the reason that you lose out of the playoffs if you're in them in week 15. So if you could just weather the storm next week, you should be set up well in the semifinals, in that matchup against the Cardinals. And just to go back on that play, like you mentioned on the free play, that was an absolute laser beam of a pass. Like, it was beautiful. It hit him right in stride. He didn't even have to put his arms out. He opened his hands up just a little bit and it just landed right in the bucket. It's going to be really interesting to see what the Bears do this offseason, because if Justin Fields keeps playing like this, like, do you go draft a quarterback? Like, I don't even know.
I still have a strong feeling. I have a feeling that they're going to just keep Justin Fields and build around him. I still feel that way right now.
I think he showed enough, if you ask me. But
listen, there's some good quarterbacks coming out, right? So there's going to be a serious conversation around it. But I think that with the right coaching, this offense can be dynamic, extremely dynamic, with Justin Fields at quarterback. I really do think so.
I think so too.
He's shown enough. right? Where the tools are there, the right coach can get the best out of him, right? He doesn't necessarily have that right now, but I think he can end up doing it. Now, speaking of the Bears, Foreman came back. He ended up leading the Bears backfield with 14 opportunities, 72 yards on 13 touches. Roschon Johnson is droppable. He was third on the depth chart in this game pretty much. Second straight game of Khalil Herbert playing second fiddle. I'm okay dropping him to 55% of snaps for Foreman. He still can't cross the RB2 threshold for me because it's still like a three-man backfield right now. If you had to desperately start one of these guys, it would be Foreman, though, as your flex play.
Desperately starting is exactly how I would qualify it. If you have to,
if you need it.
Yeah. If you need to have any of these running backs in your lineups moving forward, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone besides the person I'm playing next week in fantasy football, like you're in trouble. It's pretty clear that any offense the Bears have is going to be coming from Justin Fields and DJ Moore. The ground game is just there to fill plays where it's not one of those two doing their thing. The Bears were up all game in this one too, and then to have that kind of game script yield only 19 total touches to the running back room as a group in a positive game script, it just shows you that there's not enough there in Chicago's backfield. Make any of these guys really even worth considering in your lineup besides Foreman. And like you mentioned, desperate start right there.
On the other side, not a great week for Amon-Ra St. Brown to decide to not put up fantasy points. 9 targets, but only 3 catches for 21 yards. Him, Mike Evans, Jamar Chase, right? They all played full games, but did not come through. Very, very rough. Obviously, you're continuing to start him moving forward.
It's funny, just with Amon-Ra St. Brown. I don't know if you saw some of the posts this week, but it's like they put out, it was PFF, they put out a post that said, like, Amon-Ra St. Brown's worst fantasy week of the season, 12.9 points. They're like, talk about having a fantastic safe floor. And now he comes out and he bottoms out this week. Like, again, if you had Amon-Ra St. Brown, you're probably not, like, tilting on this a lot because you miss the playoffs because of him. But at the same time, it's, like, not ideal. Because especially, like you mentioned, if it's like you where you're fighting for positioning, maybe you're trying to get a bye, that could have been the difference.
100%, man. Moving to the Browns, look at Joe Flacco keeping the Browns receivers extremely fantasy relevant. Elijah Moore did his typical Elijah Moore thing this season, meaning he didn't really come through. Amari Cooper, 14 targets, 7 for 77. Solid game for him. David Njoku, huge advantage if you had him in your lineup. 6 for 91 and 2 touchdowns on 8 targets. Only 2 catches for 17 yards last week, but he bounced back big time in this game.
Yeah, are you salty at all? Like I am. Like I'm extremely salty. And I didn't even have David Njoku in my lineups. That he had the 27 points in the first half, and then he had none in the second half. He just did nothing. Like,
did he really have none in the second half? I didn't realize that.
Did that piss you off at all? Because it pissed me off. Because I put out the post today, and it said we got 27 fantasy points from David Njoku, and we got a whole half of football to play. Here I didn't know the game ended for David Njoku at halftime, but it did.
That's crazy.
It's just like ridiculous. I've loved the first 2 weeks of the Joe Flacco experience. All jokes aside, I don't care how many people say that he's old or he can't get it done. He was actually moving out of the pocket and throwing on the run a lot in this game. He looked pretty good doing it too. And his arm, I think it looks as good as 80% of the other arms in the league. He's thrown 5 touchdowns over his past 3 games.
Hashtag elite. Hashtag
elite. Right? That's what I'm saying. Granted, the Browns did have 2 pretty easy matchups, since Joe Flacco's been the starter. But there's an explosive element in the passing game that Flacco brings that DTR, PJ Walker, even Deshaun Watson, they weren't bringing, to the passing offense. So I'm fine starting Cooper and Njoku moving forward, and Elijah Moore too, as a flex if you need someone in a pinch. Like you mentioned, he's not going to come through and have a huge game for you, but he does have a safe enough floor where if you put him at your flex, you're not completely hung out to dry. And the way Joe Flacco is playing, like the targets are going to be there. He's thrown 40-plus passes in the 2 games he's played off the couch.
A very similar performance on the other side of the ball. 11 catches for 95 yards and 2 touchdowns for Evan Engram. It looks like without Christian Kirk, Engram is becoming a little bit of a focal point here. We saw it last week. We saw it again this week. 12 targets for him. Very, very top-heavy target distribution from Trevor Lawrence this week. Engram with 12 targets. Calvin Ridley with 13 targets. Only 4 catches, by the way. Not great. And 14 targets for Zay Jones. So 3 touchdown passes from Lawrence. 3 interceptions also. Some bad interceptions. But 257 yards. Decent numbers for fantasy. He didn't play a great game, though. He had some bad plays. Ended up making some good ones, too. But it was a little too late. At least we know that these weapons on this team, they're still very usable moving forward, despite the injury that Trevor Lawrence faced last week.
Yeah, and so with Trevor Lawrence, he had some bad plays, but can we attribute it to his ankle? He was obviously playing hurt, and that's what that happened. That's just how it happened. So I'm kind of giving him a mulligan here. But the target share, Evan Engram, he's come on these past 2 weeks. If I'm not mistaken, what does he have? 3 touchdowns in the past 2 weeks? Something like that?
Yeah, these are his first 3 touchdowns.
Yeah. It's fantastic. I did a post a little earlier in the season. I put it in one of the newsletters. It was like Evan Engram is suffering from Deontay Johnson syndrome because he's getting all of these targets, but he's not scoring touchdowns. And now they're coming in bunches. And now that Christian Kirk is out, he was like the most consistent target earner of anyone in this offense. People don't really realize that. Are we to the point now where we're writing off Calvin Ridley as a potential like target leader in this offense? Because that's kind of where I'm at. If Evan Engram is now like the number 1 guy these past 2 weeks with Christian Kirk out, like Calvin Ridley, how comfortable are you even starting him as like a wide receiver 2? Like I'm not very comfortable with that. Like
as a wide receiver 2, I'm not. I'm not comfortable as a wide receiver 2. He was a wide receiver 3 for me this week, and I think he'll continue to be a wide receiver 3 for me.
Like we knew this was a tough matchup, and that's part of it. So that's why I was like wide receiver 2. It could be in the conversation for me. At least it could have been in the conversation for me, especially with Christian Kirk going down. But Evan Engram now showing us that he's going to be getting the targets, no matter what, is kind of telling me, okay, time to roll back Calvin Ridley a little bit. That's my takeaway from what we saw today, because he had the targets, but he's clearly not getting it done to anywhere near the level that we would expect him to, given the injury to Christian Kirk and just the way that the offense is playing, in general.
And Baltimore next week doesn't make things easier for Calvin Ridley, right?
Yeah. The Rams had a decent day against them, though. That's one thing.
Yeah, well, but Stafford's playing
lights out.
Pretty damn good right now, right? Yep. Chuba Hubbard with another 20-plus carry game, 23 carries and 25 total opportunities in this one on 78% of snaps. 25 carries last week, and they have Atlanta next week. But that's 2 20-plus fantasy point days for Hubbard, and then he didn't score this week, so only 11.6 PPR fantasy points. And these 3 games that he just played, that he scored a ton of fantasy points, like they were all away from Carolina. So, and it's all about game script with Hubbard. And I'm not sure Atlanta next week will run away with the game especially with them playing in Carolina. It's a home game for them. So Hubbard will be usable once again in that one as a volume-based, like low-end RB2. The cool thing is that he's running a lot of routes compared to the other Carolina running backs as well. So he has a few outs here. He has his floor, right? And then if he scores a touchdown, you're looking at a 20-point game potentially.
Yeah, and the problem with Chuba Hubbard is he's not going to be gifted a touchdown. If they're going to be scoring a touchdown, it's going to be him doing all of the work, And this is one of those games where it was a really weird game overall. Derek Carr had terrible stats, but the Saints still put up 28 points. It was just a really weird game. But with Chuba Hubbard, you mentioned the usage that he's getting. He's been getting that the past 3 or 4 weeks now. Miles Sanders is an afterthought, even though he was pretty efficient on the carries that he got. But at that point, this game was never in hand. It doesn't really matter. Chuba Hubbard, he is the lead back at this point. Like, Miles Sanders probably isn't going to be with the team at the end of the season. They probably cut him. I'm not sure what the contract situation is, but they paid him a lot of money to do a whole lot of nothing. But Chuba Hubbard now, how he has the usage, it's not changing. And like you mentioned, he's been super startable. I'm fine with him as an RB2 moving forward.
Chuba Hubbard played 62 snaps in this game, and Miles Sanders played only 17. Okay, so that tells you what you need to know about this backfield right now. That's a huge disparity. That's the biggest disparity we've seen between these two guys this season. Yeah. The Wilson to Wilson connection is real. We talked about Zach Wilson being an upgrade for Garrett Wilson, and now we have 5 straight games of these guys getting it done despite their circumstances. Here's what Garrett Wilson has done in his last 5 games with Zach Wilson. 8 for 90 on 12 targets, 7 for 100 on 13 targets, 7 for 80 on 13 targets, 9 for 93 on 14 targets, and in this game, 9 for 108 on 14 targets. No touchdowns in this game. Well, no touchdowns at all in all these 5 games, but I will take it, okay? At least Zach has been able to get Garrett the ball. That's all we can ask for, okay? According to Fantasy Life data, fantasylife.com, he hasn't finished outside the top 16 wide receivers in any of these games, and he's averaging 37% target share in these games, okay? So you love to see it. Breece Hall is also benefiting as well. He finished top 7 in 3 of these 5 weeks as well. So who knew how happy we'd be to have Zach Wilson back?
Right? And this was the first game where the Jets, obviously they won, and it was by a lot. But this was the first time that the Jets offense, the product on field, it wasn't like we were just sitting here saying, well, at least the fantasy production was good. The product on field was good too. And that's good because, moving forward now, you have to imagine Zach Wilson could be a starter the rest of the way, regardless of what happens. Because there's no going back now. I mean, I guess we could have said the same thing, once they benched him. It's like there's no going back to Zach Wilson. But the situation they're in right now, it's just going to have to be Zach Wilson the rest of the way. I'm perfectly fine with that. The way that you see, like you mentioned, I would have listed off the game log too for Garrett Wilson to just show people, this connection that's there. People don't want to look at Zach Wilson as a quarterback that can really get it done, as someone that can have that type of connection with the receiver. But Garrett Wilson has been able to get those targets. Zach Wilson was also delivering the ball to Breece Hall. It's a huge difference from what we saw with Tim Boyle over the past 2 weeks. So good news here for Zach Wilson. I'm encouraged. I think that this can happen. These guys can have some upside, Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson moving forward, with Zach Wilson. As long as they just keep things in check, generally on offense, I think we're going to be fine. You don't have to worry about it. You can expect this type of performance moving forward.
Yep. The Texans are facing brutal injuries, and so is my fantasy team. We lost Tank Dell last week. We lost Nico Collins so early in this game. He ran 2 routes. He caught a ball on one of those routes, and he might have been on his way to a big game. We needed him. I needed him, and now he has a calf injury. He missed a couple of weeks. He missed a game a couple of weeks ago with that calf injury. Hopefully, this isn't something that will cause him to miss next week, but it is possible that he misses next week. It's possible that he misses more than next week because he re-injured his calf. So this really sucks, okay? Because he has Tennessee next week. Amazing matchup, right? In the first week of the fantasy playoffs, right? And I really wish that he would play. Can you tell that I have him on my fantasy teams? I don't know if you can tell. But
somewhat.
If Collins is back, let's say Collins is back, right? Yeah. It's possible CJ Stroud isn't available for that game because he suffered a concussion in this game. He's on the protocol, so now we have to monitor that all week long. And if Collins misses this game and if CJ Stroud plays, then you have to move Noah Brown up the ranks a little bit. And I'm guessing Robert Woods will be fantasy relevant, maybe, So imagine having to start one of those guys in your fantasy playoffs. But a lot of moving pieces here for the Texans. Ideally, in a perfect world, we have CJ Stroud and Nico Collins back next week, but it's not seemingly likely at this point.
Yeah. It's like your fantasy team, after you deal with all these injuries to the Texans, it's like building a piece of code. If CJ Stroud plays, then, you got to figure out what the conditions are and then decide what's going to happen. That. If Collins is back, but CJ Stroud isn't, it's like you got to figure out, you have to navigate that. For me, it's all going to hinge on whether CJ Stroud is back because I think there's going to be a productive wide receiver to be had in this offense as long as CJ Stroud plays. We saw Noah Brown do that a couple weeks ago. So I'm not concerned about it if CJ Stroud plays and I'm like, oh no, I got to put Noah Brown or Robert Woods in my lineup. Obviously, I prefer Noah Brown in that situation, but I think Robert Woods will have enough of a floor with the volume that he would get in that situation that he would be usable for fantasy. He wouldn't just be, rolling over and dying. But if Collins would be back and CJ Stroud doesn't play, I'm definitely worried. Because Davis Mills, I don't trust him. We've seen him. We got a whole season of him last season. I'm not expecting a whole lot from him if he does go. So my attention is going to be on CJ Stroud first, then Nico Collins. Personally, I don't think Nico Collins could be back this week. I'm not a doctor, but the way that he just left and was immediately ruled out, and he dealt with the calf injury before, it's all just like bad juju. And I don't want to trust it and be like thinking that he's going to be in my lineup in this good matchup against the Titans moving forward. I'm going to say, assume you're without him and hope for better news, later in the week. We still got time between now and later in the week, so we'll see what happens. But CJ Stroud, it seems like at the beginning of the season, nobody was coming back from the concussion protocol. They get a concussion and be like, well, they're out the next week. But recently it's been like people entered the concussion protocol, they're in it for 4 days, and then they're back. Sometimes they're ruled back in and ready to go, before Saturday some weeks. So, I'm paying attention to CJ Stroud most, then Collins. But just brutal string of injuries. I put the post out today about it. If you look at the Texans offense 2 weeks ago and then the Texans offense today, it's very, very different.
The Texans backfield moved back in the direction of Devin Singletary this week. I kind of expected this to happen. 57% of snaps for him. Davian Pierce ended up playing only 8 snaps in this game. Dara Ogunbowale played more snaps than Dameon Pierce. That tells you what you need to know. But Singletary had 63% of the running back opportunities in this one. He also had the only goal line snap as well, so that's a positive development for him. He also played a majority of the 2-minute snaps too, so he has a good role on this offense. When CJ Stroud's in there, I think Singletary, you can definitely start him, as a solid RB2 moving forward. And you want this to stick because he's been the only effective Texans running back this year.
Yeah, so I think that this is definitely a good thing for Devin Singletary as far as the usage goes. But do you think there's any caveat here? Because, we know Dameon Pierce is the early down back, quote unquote. If he was going to have a role, that would be where it is. And when you're down the entire game like they were, and you lose your starting quarterback, like, you're probably not going to be using that running back just by default. It might not be a decision to be made. Okay, we're going to have Devin Singletary in for most of the game. So for me, I don't know. I don't want to buy too much into it because we saw it switch back to Dameon Pierce a week or two ago, and now it's like it's back to Devin Singletary. I think that if you're going to have one on your roster, and this has been the consensus, it would be Devin Singletary. That's who you want on your team, who you want in your lineup. Dameon Pierce, you're obviously not starting him, but I'm still not necessarily sold, on Devin Singletary yet being the number one guy, just because this game script is way out there. And there was no reason to have Dameon
but
Pierce.
I will say, though, that the game script didn't really play a factor in this one because the game was 0-0 in the first half, right? And then Singletary basically played, like, the entire first half, like, himself, right? Dameon Pierce hardly saw the field, and Singletary was the primary early down back in this game. So because of that, I'm thinking that, okay, well, this was something that I could see coming in terms of Dameon Pierce, he got his opportunity again. He didn't, quote unquote, lose his job because of injury, right? And I think a lot of teams, a lot of coaches don't want a player to think that they lost their job because of an injury. And that would have been the case if Dameon Pierce didn't get an opportunity again, right? He got his opportunity last week. He squandered it. And now Devin Singletary came back and ended up doing his thing. That's kind of how I'm looking at this situation. So I think moving forward now, it's going to be Singletary's job. Will Dameon Pierce end up messing things up here and there with a goal line touchdown here, a goal line touch here and that? Maybe, probably. But I do think that Singletary's way safer moving forward. This is kind of what you want to see. Now the opportunity is kind of matching what we've kind of known about this backfield over the past several weeks. So hoping that this sticks. Like you, I'm not 100% sold. But I think this is kind of in my head coming into this week, I told myself, I said, hey, listen, if Singletary ends up, being the guy for the most part, I think I would trust it a lot more. So that's kind of how I'm viewing it moving forward.
Right.
Okay. Now, remember this guy, what's his name? Cooper Kupp?
Yeah.
8 catches.
I think I remember him.
10 targets, 115 yards and a touchdown. Looked eerily similar to that other Cooper Kupp that we all know and love. Okay, so not really sure what Demarcus Robinson is doing with 10 targets, but I'm assuming that's not going to continue. But Kupp is heating up at the right time here. Okay, Kupp and Puka are both getting the target shares. Matthew Stafford is playing very well right now. Look at how he's looked against two of the best defenses these last 2 weeks. Okay, that was a gauntlet, dude. Going up against the Browns and the Ravens. And look how he's played. And now these wide receivers, right, have Washington next week at home. They are absolutely must-starts for that matchup. Did you just say, I just heard something. You just get, I just heard that. Oh, yeah, baby.
You're licking my chops with that one. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, my mic is good. You can't hear me licking my chops.
Your mic is way too good, bro. Because I just heard, I just heard something. I heard that. But these guys are absolutely must-starts for that matchup. Stafford is 100% in play as well. He's had 3 straight big fantasy days. He's thrown 10 touchdowns over these last 3 weeks. Pretty good.
Yeah, pretty good. Fantastic. This is a complete turnaround from what we were seeing earlier in the season where there was no upside. And we were all panicking a couple weeks ago about Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. It's okay, Matthew Stafford, that was the reason we were all panicking. It was Matthew Stafford hasn't looked like Matthew Stafford. Now these past 3 weeks, he's turned it on. And they're playing very well. And they play well enough to win that game. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I just want to comment on this quick just because it was such a ridiculous finish. You talk about the Ravens scoring the touchdown. It was the punt return. And it just reminded me of the Jets game earlier in the season in week 1 against the Bills. And then you had after the game, everyone was circling the one guy who was quote unquote holding and oh, they missed a call on the last punt. I was this feels just like the Jets game all over again. That I just Had to get that out there because it was just something I saw that was hilarious. But you look back at what this is, like Demarcus Robinson, I don't think he's going to stick around getting 10 targets like you mentioned, but he does seem like he's part of the offense. I don't want to say that it's somebody that you should be picking up. Like maybe you had him near waivers if you're really thin at wide receiver, but it's Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua right now. Like you mentioned, I don't want to just like re-anoint Cooper Kupp as like this. He's back. This is Cooper Kupp again. Everything's good, but this is a step in the right direction 100%. Like you mentioned, if we can treat this, if he can turn this not into just like heating up a streak now, it's not just like a blip on the radar, which is very possible with them going to the Commanders next week. Like this could put them right in tune, for what we want to see from them the rest of the way. Like Puka Nacua, I know Demarcus Robinson got a lot of targets, but Puka Nacua had 8 targets of his own. I'm not worried about it. And he had that one diving catch that was just like, come on, man. It was ridiculous.
So pretty.
Yeah. Beautiful.
So nice. He was so
the
hyped
ball
for
placement,
it too.
Yeah. He still right, was like, they got it on the hot mic. It was awesome.
Hell yeah, man. So yeah, no, and like you said, Demarcus Robinson definitely worth considering picking up in deeper leagues because he ran the same amount of routes as Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua in this game. Okay, so they played primarily 11 personnel, pretty much exclusively 11 personnel, 3 wide receivers on the field, and he was one of those wide receivers on the field. Okay, so something to keep in mind for sure. On the other side of the ball, Zay Flowers and OBJ ended up leading the Ravens with 10 targets each. Isaiah likely also got it done, 5 for 83 and a touchdown. But OBJ had that long 46-yard touchdown. He finished with 97 yards and a touchdown. I mentioned last week that his target share has been creeping up. His targets per route run has been damn near 50% over the previous 2 weeks. But I think the biggest development this week was his route participation. It finally went up to 60%. According to FantasyLife.com's free utilization report, it's the highest it's been since week 9. I think he's a little bit more trustworthy moving forward. You want those routes to still go up here, but it's looking like when he's on the field, Lamar is targeting him, right? So I liked him this week as a high-end flex play, and I think he might enter the wide receiver 3 conversation in a good matchup against the Jaguars. We know that Lamar loves targeting OBJ deep, and coming into week 14, the Jaguars are allowing the 3rd highest rate of 40-plus yard receiving plays. Okay, so he's in heavy consideration for some upside in my lineup in week 15.
Absolutely, and that comes off of the matchup 100%. That just makes it even better. On the heels of a good game like he just had today, you have a good matchup coming in next week. That's fantastic. The other thing, like you mentioned, does Lamar Jackson like targeting OBJ deep? How many times do you see him drop back? And I don't know if you noticed Lamar Jackson's throwing motion. It's just hilarious. It's like a baseball player. You just see him like flick his wrist sideways, and the ball just goes 40 yards downfield. And it's like every time they pan the camera down the field, it's OBJ. And there were a couple plays where Lamar Jackson was short, but it worked out. OBJ, he had 2 plays today where it was like elite adjustment. I don't know if you saw it. The first one was on touchdown, obviously late, but then the second one was also to get a first down where Lamar Jackson just kind of sailed it. But Odell was like, he spun all the way around with his head looking up, like his face was up in the sky. Like he's back. I don't want to say he's back. I don't want to say he looked like, I don't want to say he's back to like vintage Odell.
It's that raw ability. It's that raw ability that he has that just comes out. Even though he's an older receiver, even though he's not the same guy, that raw ability comes out in these playmaking moments.
And it's still there. That's the thing for me. Like people would probably think, oh, Odell Beckham Jr. And I don't want to say I was guilty of this, but I was definitely writing off OBJ a little bit earlier in the season because I was looking at the guys around him. I was like, Zay Flowers, super dynamic, super young, And it's weird because Zay Flowers had a good game too with OBJ coming on. Lamar Jackson also, by the way, let's just put this out there, had his best fantasy day in a long time today. That was awesome. He had 30-plus points. Fantastic. If they can just bottle up that type of passing attack, with what they're doing in the ground game, like they're going to be unstoppable, and that's going to be great news for fantasy football. And they've taken the step in the right direction. But it looks like you mentioned, Odell Beckham Jr. is going to be a piece to have on your team, not just as somebody on the bench that you throw in. He might be somebody that you're starting, making decisions about, moving forward. So that's good.
The Vikings-Raiders almost went scoreless the entire game, okay? But the Vikings ended up scoring a field goal. This game ended 3-0. Absolutely unbelievable. But believe it or not, there are actually a few takeaways from this game. Josh Jacobs got hurt, okay? He left the game with a knee injury. We'll have to monitor that. Zamir White, I think, for me, would probably be the guy for that early down role. Chargers next week, Chiefs after that, and then Colts after that. All solid matchups for running backs. And then on top of that, like the way the Raiders defense is playing, like you probably shouldn't expect the game script to really get away from them in any of these games, even the Chiefs game, right? This is a division game. I feel like Chiefs offense isn't that good anyway, so I don't really expect I don't really expect the game script to really get away from them. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. But it's like, just hearing the generalization about the Chiefs offense not being that good, like, I haven't heard that in a long time. Like, since Patrick Mahomes, like, it wasn't even, like, we weren't even sniffing, like, the Chiefs offense not being that good. And now it's like, man, they could be in trouble. They're not doing well on offense. So I think you're right on that point right there. The game script isn't going to get away. I hope Josh Jacobs isn't out too long. We'll monitor that, like you mentioned. Zamir White would be the pickup. But for me, like, I'm not buying a whole lot into this offense outside of Josh Jacobs. And Devontae Adams, he had some target share like usual today, but there wasn't a whole lot of upside. It was just a ridiculous game. Like, this didn't feel like the game that would be 0-0 into the fourth quarter. Like,
right.
That was supposed to be the Steelers and the Patriots. This game had no business being as low scoring as it was.
Justin Jefferson, he also left this game in the first half. Not good. Okay, he ended up going to the hospital after this game. It's possible that he has fractured ribs. This absolutely sucks, man. Like, coming off of IR, now he might end up missing week 15, and if Jefferson misses next week, I guess you'd be willing to start Addison as wide receiver 3, then TJ Hawkinson probably get his targets as well, but I don't know, man. And also, by the way, like, we have no idea who's going to be starting at quarterback for the Vikings next week because Josh Dobbs was benched in this game for Nick Mullins. So now we have no idea who the quarterback's going to be. So
just ridiculous.
A lot of uncertainty right now. And this really sucks, right? A lot of injuries. And Alexander Mattison also hurt his ankle. That could be a high ankle sprain, which would mean that Ty Chandler would end up being the guy for the next couple of weeks if that is the injury, if it ends up being a high ankle sprain. But, hopefully we hear more on that soon so we'll know what to do before waivers. But so many injuries, man. So many injuries.
Just ridiculous. Yeah, and for me, I don't know. If we're right back to square one. Because the way they talk about Justin Jefferson's injury, the way it looked, all this stuff, I don't know if he's going to be out a week, if he's going to be out multiple weeks. I'm not sure. He might not miss time. I'm not a doctor. I don't know what's coming. But the switch at quarterback, another thing was, I don't know if you saw this report. Maybe it was just me. But they said, like, Josh Dobbs went out and he was being checked for some knee injury. And that might have been a reason why he was pulled out of the game. I don't know. There's a justification either way. Because your team has scored 0 points, all game. You could pull Josh Dobbs realistically at that point. But for me, I don't know how much the quarterback change makes a difference to me. Like, the caliber of the quarterback play, like, maybe Josh Dobbs can extend the play a little bit better than Nick Mullins. Right. But I don't know how much of a delta there is between their talent and what they're going to do for the Vikings offense. It's just we're back to the same spot as we were coming into the last week where Justin Jefferson was out of the picture. I would go into this week assuming Justin Jefferson is not going to play week 15, just based off the nature of the injury that we saw, and that you're going to be looking at Hawkinson as a guy that's probably going to lead the team in targets. Jordan Addison, shaky start at best. I'd say he's a flex. I don't even know if I trust him there. Just the way that he's been producing, because his production was tied to Kirk Cousins. He hasn't produced the same way as he had earlier in the season these past few weeks. So for me, not a whole lot changes. And Alexander Mattison, if you replace him with Ty Chandler, it seems like it's, pretty much the same thing there too. So there's a lot of turnover, but there's not that much of a delta, I don't think, between any of these players. And you're going to get probably the same schematic, look at them every way.
I would say there would be a significant, increase in running back production for fantasy because, like, you could really start either of these guys, Mattison or, but if you can start one of them, then, like, you can get some fantasy points here, right? Like, regardless of who the quarterback is. So I think one of these guys could enter the RB2 conversation if it was just them. Mattison had that opportunity early on. He squandered it, right? Like, he had the opportunity. He had the snaps. He had the touches. He just couldn't come through. Now, will Ty Chandler take advantage of that opportunity? Possibly. Like, if he gets 18 touches, like, can he come through as an RB2? Yeah, I think he can. He has that explosive ability, too. Much more explosive than Mattison. So I think there is a possibility that, he could end up being in lineups next week. Now, it's funny because what I was thinking was, like, one of the reasons that Josh Dobbs could have been benched in this game was because of the throw that he gave to Justin Jefferson that ended up causing the hit, right, on him. So it's like, Kevin O'Connell was probably like, dude, you just injured my star wide receiver. You're out of here, right? Like, I can totally see that happening because it was a bad throw that Justin Jefferson, first of all, Jefferson dusted the corner, whoever was in coverage. I don't know who it was on that play. Dusted him, went to the middle of the field, had to reach up to grab that ball, and then he got hit while he was grabbing that ball. So, like, if it was a better ball, or if he just didn't throw it, Justin Jefferson would be fine, right? And
but
unfortunately,
at the same time, if you're not throwing to Justin Jefferson, then he gets flamed for that. It's like, why aren't you using your top weapon?
Well,
I don't know.
Sure, but like it was just a dangerous throw, right? And it's one of those things Tom Brady talked about.
He hung him out to dry.
Before he hung him out to dry. That's pretty much what it is. So, yeah, it sucks. All right, moving on. Speaking of injuries, Justin Herbert fractured his index finger on his right hand. I imagine that he'd be missing next week as well. Who knows if he'll be back this season? This absolutely sucks. I'm talking like this because I don't know how else to talk. So we'll keep monitoring that. That would
so many. It's like we've been through this so many times.
Yeah, exactly. This would obviously affect Keenan Allen next week with Easton Stick most likely starting. But I will not think about benching Keenan Allen, even if Herbert misses time.
Yeah, no. There's no argument to be made for benching Keenan Allen in any situation because he's still going to have 10, 12 target upside every single week because he's all they have left in the passing game at this point. There's nobody else.
Besides Austin Ekeler. Okay, the Chargers only scored 7 points, and that one touchdown ended up coming from Austin Ekeler. Goal line touchdown. He came through when it mattered. Okay, 10 carries, 51 yards, and that touchdown. 5 catches for 49 yards. He looked a lot better in this game. They gave Isaiah Spiller 6 carries. They gave Josh Galley 3 carries. So Ekeler only had about 50% of the rushing attempts when, he usually averages around 70%, right? But I'd imagine that goes up after this game, after how effective he was overall, and then how ineffective those other running backs were.
Yeah, this is a situation where Austin Ekeler, he's going to be, pretty much at the mercy of the offense. And I know he scored the only points of the game. I don't want to buy too much into this one just because, the way that the game went, the Chargers have been horrific on offense these past few weeks. Were you watching a game at all? Like, did you see it? They announced the touchdown. Yeah. They announced the touchdown for the Chargers, like their first offensive touchdown in how many quarters? It's like, oh my God. I don't know what's going on, but now that Justin Herbert's out, I don't really want to trust Ekeler,
Brandon Staley needs to go.
Yeah.
Get him out of there.
Okay. That's been like a given. We know. That's been a given.
And I would argue, now there is no way you let him go on to week 15. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But at this point, the season is over for the Chargers.
Yeah.
Like the damage has been done. You have now sacrificed your 2023 season.
You got week 15, week 16, week 17, week 18. You got a whole month of games here. Okay.
But who are you going? Like, what are you going? Yeah, he'll fire him. But what are you going to gain?
Well, it's an interim.
You know what I mean?
Listen, morale.
I
right?
guess maybe
you just see what you can get out of certain players with a different coach, right? Interim coach, get some energy in there because you have a whole 4 games here. It'll be bad.
I feel like it's an easier answer to say fire him now, but if Justin Herbert were healthy we knew he was going to be healthy. Because now It's like, what are you going to learn from a team with an interim head coach if they have Easton Stick at quarterback? Like, it's just going to make whoever the interim head coach is look bad. So it's like, it's tough. Like, just let Brandon Staley ride out. Yeah, just let it go. Just let him add to his get fired resume at this point because you're probably going to fire him anyway.
All right. Moving on. 49ers. Every single 49ers player basically came through for you this week. Pretty much. Yeah. Right? Brock Purdy came through. Christian McCaffrey, 16 carries, 145 yards. He came through. He only had 1 catch, but it didn't matter. He ended up coming through for you for the most part. But no touchdowns. It is what it is. But Arizona, next week for running backs, like he'll make up for it next week. Okay? He'll probably have like 4 touchdowns next week. And then, you look at what these guys did. Deebo Samuel, 7 catches, 149 yards. Brandon Ayuk, 6 catches, 126 yards. George Kittle, 76 yards and a touchdown. Deebo Samuel, by the way, also had a rushing touchdown in this game, too. He just went bonkers in this game, dude. He's been on a tear over these last 3 games.
He's completely taken over. And it's funny, I just looked at it since he said Christian McCaffrey's probably going to score 4 touchdowns against the Cardinals next week. You know how many touchdowns he had the first time they played against the Cardinals? He had 4 touchdowns. Yeah. Like, that's very much on the table, when we have these discussions about Christian McCaffrey. So, yeah, he'll probably come through next week, just correct any wrongdoing he did for you with a 16-point performance. Oh, terrible, what are you going to do? But Deebo Samuel for me that's like the biggest thing there. He's looking like 2021 Deebo Samuel again, and they're not just relegating him to a point where he's getting just a couple touches. He had more targets. He had a couple carries this game. His usage has been like really low compared to the production he's been putting up. But now the usage looks a little bit closer to what we want it to be, for this to be considered like, sustainable production. But when you're on the 49ers offense, you can be touchdown dependent and just survive. Brandon Ayuk didn't even score a touchdown. He came through, like you mentioned. Christian McCaffrey's the same story. There's so many points to go around. It's just a matter of who's getting it any given week. So
this week, all of them got it.
Yeah, you start all of your 49ers. This isn't like any new analysis we're doing, but you start all of them and you're just happy about it at this point, the way that the 49ers offense is playing.
Zach Charbonnet was very involved this week. He actually out-carried Kenneth Walker in the first half, so who knows if they were trying to limit Kenneth Walker or what. But as of right now, the Seattle backfield is a timeshare between these two guys. Walker was shaken up after a play late in the game, so monitor anything there. But Philly and then Tennessee the next 2 weeks for this backfield is not ideal. Okay, so not really excited to start either of these guys right now. Okay.
No.
I know.
Hang on, just before we
go.
Like, are you considering either of them in like the RB2 conversation? Like, or is it low
neither
RB2
of them will
at
be
best?
ranked as a neither of them will be ranked as an RB2 next week, most likely, with right. No teams on bye.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a good point right there. Yeah, it's gonna make it tough. I hear you.
It's gonna make it tough. It is. I need to see a game from Walker to like kind of take over that backfield again. Didn't happen this week. I want to move to the Bills and Chiefs game. We won't be talking about Eagles Cowboys because that game hasn't happened yet.
It's
We're
happening.
like in the middle of that game right now. It's happening right now. No idea what's happening in that game because I have it on delay and I'll watch it right after this. But Bills